I smelled the smoke before I saw the glow, standing on my own porch at 10 at night, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and 26 years of reading exactly that particular smell for a living told me everything I needed to know before I ever picked up the phone. Wind-driven, fast-moving, close. I've smelled 1,000 fires in my career, from the seat of a truck 3 ridgelines away, from inside a burned structure the day after, from close enough to feel the heat pressing against my face shield. And there's a specific quality to the smell of a fire that is actively winning against whoever is trying to stop it. An acrid, moving quality entirely different from the settled, smoldering smell of something already contained. This was the first kind. By the time the first engine reached my gate, headlights cutting through smoke thick enough to taste, the north barn was fully involved. Orange light throwing long shadows across ground I'd walked 10,000 times. The equipment shed was gone, collapsed into itself the way structures do once the roof finally gives, and the fire had already crossed into the historic ranch house my great-grandfather built in 1911. The house I'd spent 4 years and more money than I care to remember restoring. Board by original board, watching flame move through the same rooms where my wife and I had spent 31 years of evenings, faster than any crew, however good, could reasonably have been expected to stop it. By morning, Kellerman Ranch, appraised 8 months earlier at just over $6 million, sat in ash. 22 head of cattle dead, some of them bloodlines I'd spent 15 years carefully building back after my father's herd had been sold off during a lean decade before I ever took over the operation. A century of family history burned down to foundation stone. My great-grandfather's original construction, my grandfather's additions, my own father's careful maintenance through decades I barely remembered, and 31 years of my own life with Odalise. All of it reduced, in a single overnight wind event, to blackened stone and the particular flat. Ashen smell that doesn't fully leave a person's memory for a very long time afterward. And the fire, once the investigation finally ran its full course, traced back not to lightning, not to a down power line, not to any act of nature the Sabino Vista Estates Homeowners Association would spend the next 14 months insisting it was, but to an unpermitted, uncertified prescribed burn the association's own board had authorized on its greenbelt 11 days earlier. Run by a crew with no state fire management certification, on a red flag wind warning day the board had been notified about and chosen to ignore, all to save roughly $40,000 against the cost of hiring a properly licensed contractor. Before I tell you exactly how that decision ended with a $13 million judgment and a state-ordered dissolution of the entire board that made it, you should understand who I am, because the reason I knew within about 11 days exactly what had actually happened, while the HOA's own attorney was still calling it an act of God in writing, is the same reason this case moved as fast and as completely as it eventually did. My name is Weston Kellerman, 62 years old, 26 of those years spent as a wildland fire investigator for the State Forestry Division. The last 9 of them as the division's regional fire marshal before I retired 3 years ago, the kind of career that has you standing in more burned-out structures than any person should reasonably have to, learning to read a fire scene the way other people read a book. The char patterns and the burn indicators and the wind data, all telling a story that rarely lines up with whatever story the person responsible for it wants told instead. I retired onto the same ranch my family has worked since 1889, for generations of Kellermans running cattle on land that had, over those 13 decades, become considerably more valuable than any of us had ever set out to make it, not through speculation, but through the same patient, unglamorous accumulation that built the barn, restored the original ranch house, and built a herd that took most of my adult life to establish. My wife, Odalise, no relation to the architect I'd later hire for the rebuild, a coincidence of names I never quite got used to explaining to people. Past 4 years before the fire, and the ranch had become, in the years since, considerably more than a working operation to me. It was the last place that still felt entirely like both of us at once. The kitchen she'd remodeled herself the year before she got sick, the rose garden along the south fence she'd planted, and I'd kept alive out of pure stubbornness ever since. The porch where we'd sat most evenings for 31 years watching exactly the kind of western sunset that had nothing whatsoever to do with why I'd fallen in love with this particular piece of ground in the first place, and everything to do with why. I never once, in 26 years of a career that could have taken me almost anywhere, considered living anywhere else. Sabino Vista Estates, 180 homes built out over the past decade on land that had been an old citrus operation before that, sits directly uphill from my western pasture, separated from Kellerman Ranch by nothing more than a shared fence line, and about 400 yards of open grassland the association had, 3 years earlier, designated as a wildfire mitigation greenbelt. A genuinely sensible idea in a region where fire risk is simply part of how you're supposed to think about land, undermined entirely by how the board that ran it actually chose to execute the idea. Diane Sorrell had been Sabino Vista's HOA president for just over 2 years by the time all of this happened, having campaigned, according to residents I spoke with afterward, on a platform of fiscal responsibility and proactive risk management, language she used at every board meeting the way some people use a hammer, treating every disagreement about spending as evidence the other person simply didn't understand how a well-run association was supposed to operate. The Greenbelt's annual fuel reduction burn, a genuinely necessary piece of wildfire mitigation for a property backing directly onto working ranch land, had for its first 2 years been handled by a state-licensed prescribed fire contractor at a cost of roughly $55,000. A line item Diane had specifically flagged at 2 consecutive budget meetings, according to minutes I would eventually obtain, as an area where the association is significantly overpaying for a service several vendors could provide more efficiently. The vendor Diane's board ultimately selected for the 3rd year's burn was a landscaping and land clearing outfit called Cimarron Grounds Management, whose owner, a man named Kyle Purnell, held a general contracting license but no state wildland fire or prescribed burn certification whatsoever, a distinction that matters enormously in this state, where conducting a prescribed burn without proper certification and, critically, without a valid burn permit issued by the County Fire Authority is not a gray area or a technicality. It is in the plainest possible terms illegal, precisely because uncertified operators lack the training to read wind conditions, humidity, and fuel moisture the way a licensed burn boss is required to, the exact training gap that turned a routine fuel reduction burn into the kind of disaster that burned 22 head of cattle and 114 years of family history to the ground in a single night. I did not know any of that the night it happened. I knew only what 26 years of professional habit told me the moment I smelled that smoke. This was moving too fast, in a direction the wind that evening had no business carrying it, and by the time county fire crews finally had it contained the following afternoon, having burned across nearly the entire western half of Kellerman Ranch before a shifted overnight wind finally slowed it enough for full suppression, there was very little left of my life's work standing above the foundation line. Diane Sorrell arrived at my gate 2 days later. Once the ash had cooled enough for anyone to safely walk the ground, dressed, I noticed even through the particular numbness of standing in the ruins of my own family history, in a blazer that looked considerably more suited to a real estate closing than a condolence visit. "Mr. Kellerman," she said, "on behalf of the board, I want to express how deeply sorry we all are for what happened. This was an unprecedented weather event, and I want to assure you the association is fully cooperating with the investigation." "What weather event?" I said, because 26 years of reading exactly this kind of statement had already told me what I was about to hear, and I wanted her to say it plainly, out loud, so there would be no ambiguity about it later. "The wind shift," she said. "Our fire mitigation contractor conducted the burn under conditions that were, at the time, within normal seasonal parameters. Unfortunately, weather can change unpredictably, and I think we all have to accept that some of what happened was simply beyond anyone's control. I want to be precise about something here, because it mattered enormously to everything that followed. I had spent 26 years specifically investigating exactly this kind of claim, the confident, plausible-sounding assertion that an uncontrolled fire was simply an act of unpredictable nature rather than the foreseeable consequence of a decision someone made to cut a corner. I know, from that entire career, That the weather changed unpredictably is very often the first sentence spoken by someone who already knows, somewhere underneath the calm delivery, that the weather was never actually the problem. Was there a burn permit? I asked her, issued by the county fire authority for that burn? Something in her expression shifted, just slightly. The particular recalibration of someone who had clearly rehearsed several versions of this conversation and had not fully anticipated the one currently unfolding. I need to check with our contractor on the specific documentation, she said, but I can assure you the board acted entirely in good faith based on the information available to us at the time. I did not call a lawyer that day. I called Marcus Delgado instead, my former deputy fire marshal, still active with the division, and asked him, as a colleague rather than a claimant, whether he could confirm for me, through official channels, whether Cimarron Grounds Management held a current prescribed burn certification and whether a valid permit had been issued for a burn on the Sabino Vista Greenbelt 11 days before my ranch burned. Marcus called me back the following morning, and I could hear, even before he said a word, the particular careful weight in his voice that 26 years of working alongside him had taught me to recognize as him about to tell me something he already knew I wasn't going to like hearing confirmed. Wes, he said, Cimarron Grounds Management holds a general contracting license. Nothing else. No wildland fire certification, no prescribed burn endorsement, nothing on file with the state at all. And I pulled the county fire authority's permit log for the past 60 days. There's no record of any burn permit issued to Sabino Vista Estates or to Cimarron Grounds for any date in the relevant window. I sat with that for a long moment, standing in what remained of my own kitchen, the smell of smoke still clinging to everything that hadn't actually burned. There's more, Marcus said. I pulled the weather data for that day, out of habit before I called you. Red flag warning issued by the National Weather Service at 6 a.m. that morning. Sustained winds forecast at 18 to 22 miles per hour by early afternoon, gusting higher. County Fire Authority sends an automatic advisory to every registered burn permit holder whenever a red flag warning goes active, recommending immediate postponement of any scheduled burn. Since Sabino Vista never actually held a permit, they wouldn't have received that advisory through official channels. But Wes, I checked the county's general emergency notification system too, the one that goes out to every registered address in a fire risk zone regardless of permit status. Sabino Vista's HOA office is registered on that system. That warning went to their own inbox at 6:14 that morning, 7 hours before the burn crew ever lit anything. I called Priya Vasquez, a land use and property litigation attorney whose name I'd kept from a fire liability conference years earlier. The kind of contact you collect over a long career without ever quite expecting to need, and told her everything Marcus had confirmed. Weston, she said, once I'd finished, I need you to understand what you're describing. This isn't simply a case of negligence anymore. If the board received a red flag warning that morning and proceeded with an unpermitted, uncertified burn anyway, that's evidence of reckless disregard, not simple carelessness. That distinction matters enormously for what kind of damages we're eventually able to pursue. What followed over the next several weeks turned what could have been a straightforward, if devastating, insurance claim into something considerably larger. Diane's public posture, once word of the investigation and my former colleague's involvement began circulating through Sabino Vista's own community channels, shifted from quiet cooperation into something closer to open defensiveness. She sent a community-wide newsletter describing an ongoing dispute with our neighboring landowner regarding the cause of the recent wildfire, language that positioned the fire's origin as a genuinely contested question rather than the increasingly well-documented finding it had already become, and organized what she called a community information session, at which she reassured residents that the association's insurance would ultimately resolve this matter appropriately. A statement made. Roughly a week after that same insurance carrier had already issued its formal denial, a fact Diane's newsletter did not mention. A resident I never met directly, someone posting under a pseudonym in Sabino Vista's private community forum, according to screenshots Priscilla forwarded me later, speculated that I had conveniently retired from fire investigation right before a fire that happens to benefit my own insurance claim, a suggestion so far removed from how insurance claims, retirement timelines, or basic causality actually function that Priya laughed out loud, reading it over the phone, though she also noted more seriously that it was worth preserving as evidence of the kind of narrative Diane's board appeared willing to let circulate rather than correct. The Sabino Vista Estates Homeowners Association's insurance carrier, once formally notified of the claim, conducted its own preliminary review and denied coverage within 3 weeks, citing the absence of a valid burn permit as evidence the burn had been conducted outside the scope of any activity the policy was ever designed to cover. A denial that should have prompted Diane's board to approach me directly about a negotiated settlement funded through the association's reserves. Instead, according to Priscilla and Okonkwo, a board member who called me directly 6 weeks after the fire, deeply uneasy about a decision, she said she'd only fully understood the implications of once the insurance denial came through. The board voted 3-2 to retain outside counsel and formally contest liability, on the theory that the wind shift itself, rather than the decision to burn on a red flag day with an uncertified crew in the first place, represented the genuine proximate cause of the damage. I want you to know I've voted against that decision, Priscilla told me, sitting across from me at a diner off the highway 2 weeks after that call, sliding a manila folder across the table the way I imagine this kind of evidence has changed hands in exactly this kind of story more times than anyone could count. I've been on this board for 4 years. I pulled every email and text thread I still had access to once I understood what actually happened that day. Diane knew Cimarron wasn't certified. There's an email from Kyle Purnell himself, sent to Diane directly, disclosing plainly that his company held only a general contracting license and recommending the board hire a certified prescribed burn contractor instead, given the scale and risk profile of the Greenbelt burn. Diane's reply, and I have the full thread, says, and I'm reading you her exact words. Understood, but the board has already approved this year's budget, and we can't justify the cost difference to residents. Proceed as discussed. I handed that folder to Priya the same afternoon. What emerged over the following months, once formal discovery compelled production of the association's complete internal communications, financial records, and board meeting minutes for the preceding 3 years, was a considerably more complete picture than even Priscilla's folder alone had suggested. Diane had specifically selected Cimarron Grounds Management over 2 competing bids from properly certified prescribed burn contractors, both submitted the same month, both priced within a few $1,000s of each other and roughly $55,000 above Cimarron's uncertified quote, a cost differential Diane had described in a board communication entered into the record as not something residents should be asked to absorb for what amounts to the same basic outcome. The morning of red flag warning, sent to the HOA's registered emergency contact address at 6:14 a.m., had been received and, according to the office's own email logs, opened by Diane's executive assistant at 6:41, forwarded internally to Diane herself with a note reading only FYI, see below, at 6:53. With no record anywhere in the association's files of any subsequent communication to Cimarron Grounds recommending postponement. The burn had proceeded on schedule at 1 o'clock that afternoon, 7 hours after the warning arrived, under wind conditions that, by the County Fire Authority's own after-the-fact analysis, had already exceeded safe prescribed burn thresholds by the time the crew lit their first line. The hearing, roughly a year after the fire, was not short, given the scale of what had accumulated by then, but it was by every account I heard from people who sat through the full proceeding, unusually one-sided for a case involving damages of that size. The gallery filled steadily over the course of the week-long trial, several Sabino Vista residents attending on their own time once word spread through the community about exactly what discovery had uncovered, Priscilla Okonkwo among them, sitting near the back most days with the same quiet, uneasy attention she'd carried since the diner booth conversation months earlier. Diane's attorney opened by attempting to frame the wind shift as an unforeseeable natural event, describing the fire as a tragic confluence of weather conditions no reasonable board could have fully anticipated. That framing survived almost exactly as long as it took Priya to enter Kyle Purnell's original email into evidence, projected onto the courtroom screen in full, followed by Diane's own reply approving the uncertified contractor specifically to save cost, followed by the red flag warning timestamp, and the internal forwarding chain, showing it reaching Diane's own inbox 7 hours before the burn, followed by Marcus Delgado's expert testimony. Marcus spent nearly 90 minutes on the stand, walking the jury through fire behavior analysis with the same unhurried, methodical precision I'd watch him bring to actual fire scenes for the better part of 2 decades, using wind data, fuel moisture readings, and photographs of the burn site to explain exactly why a certified burn boss reading those same conditions that morning would have postponed without hesitation, and exactly why an uncertified crew, lacking that specific training, would have had no framework for recognizing the danger at all. "This isn't a close call," he told the jury, in the specific plain language I'd heard him use in 100 prior testimonies. A red flag warning on the morning of a scheduled burn is not a suggestion. It's the single clearest signal our profession has for telling someone not to light a fire that day. Somebody read that signal and decided the schedule mattered more. Diane did not testify in her own defense, a decision Priya later told me she suspected was the correct strategic call, though it meant the jury's only real window into her thinking came through her own written words, entered one after another into a record that grew harder to argue around with each new exhibit. Judge Adelaide Ferris, a measured jurist with a reputation, Priya told me beforehand, for treating claims of corporate or institutional recklessness with considerably more seriousness than most courts extend to simple negligence, asked Diane's attorney a single question midway through his closing argument that effectively ended whatever remaining defense he'd hoped to mount. "Counsel, your client's own email correspondence shows she selected an uncertified contractor specifically to save cost over 2 competing certified bids and received a red flag wind warning 7 hours before the burn without communicating it to the crew she'd hired. At what point in that sequence does this remain simple negligence, rather than a knowing disregard for a risk your client had every reason to understand?" He did not have an answer because there wasn't one to give. The jury's verdict, once deliberations concluded 4 days later, reflected the full scale of what the evidence had shown. Compensatory damages, covering the ranch's full appraised value, the herd, equipment, and the specific, irreplaceable restoration cost of the century-old ranch house, came to just over $5 million. Punitive damages, awarded specifically to address what the jury's own finding described as conscious disregard for a known and communicated risk, added $8 million more, bringing the total judgment to $13,100,000, a figure that sat in the courtroom for a long moment once Judge Ferris finished reading it. The particular heavy silence that settles over a room once everyone present is finished doing the arithmetic on what a number that size actually means for the people sitting at the defense table. Judge Ferris was not finished, citing the specific pattern of documented financial mismanagement that had emerged during discovery, including evidence that Diane's board had, in the years preceding the fire, repeatedly bypassed properly licensed contractors across multiple maintenance categories specifically to preserve reserve funds for a planned clubhouse renovation the board had never disclosed to residents as a competing budget priority. The court referred the entire matter to the state's common interest community oversight office, which, 6 weeks later, following its own independent review, issued an order dissolving the Sabino Vista Estates Homeowners Association's sitting board in its entirety, appointing a court-supervised receiver to manage the association's affairs for a period of 18 months while a fully reconstituted board, elected under direct oversight, took shape. Diane Sorrell did not attend the receivership hearing. She had, according to Priscilla, already listed her Sabino Vista home for sale the week the jury's verdict came down and moved out of state entirely before the receivership order was finalized, leaving behind a personal judgment for the portion of punitive damages her homeowner's insurance and the association's own coverage both declined to satisfy, a debt that, as far as I've been told, continues to follow her. The rebuilding of Kellerman Ranch took the better part of 2 years, funded by the judgment rather than by whatever insurance claim the association's carrier might eventually have been forced to pay had the case simply settled quietly. I worked with a historic preservation architect out of the regional university, a careful, patient woman named Odalise Farrow, who specialized in exactly the kind of reconstruction this project demanded, rebuilding the ranch house not as a modern replica, but as faithfully as original photographs, surviving foundation stone, and my own great-grandfather's handwritten construction notes, discovered in a fireproof strongbox that had, against every reasonable expectation, survived the fire intact in what remained of the old root cellar could make possible. Odalise spent the first 3 months of the project simply cataloging what remained, matching char-scarred foundation stones against a century of family photographs, insisting, over my own occasional impatience, to simply start rebuilding, that getting the details right mattered more than getting them fast, a philosophy I recognized more than once during that long first winter, as almost identical to the patience my own career had spent 26 years teaching me to respect in other contexts. Entirely, I restocked the herd the following spring, working with a rancher 2 counties over who'd known my father and remembered, better than I sometimes did myself, exactly which bloodlines my family had spent 3 generations carefully building. He drove out personally the day the first trailer arrived, stood at the gate with me watching the cattle move out into pasture that had, less than 2 years earlier, been nothing but ash and blackened fence posts, and said only, "Your grandfather would have liked seeing this line back on this ground," which was from a man who rarely said much of anything at all, about as complete a blessing as I could have asked for. I stood at the edge of the west pasture the morning the new cattle first went out to graze, coffee going cold in my hand the way it always seems to when I stand somewhere too long thinking instead of drinking, and watch the greenbelt on the far side of the fence line, now managed under the receivership's oversight by a properly certified contractor, conducting its annual fuel reduction burn the correct way for the first time in 3 years. A controlled, patient line of low flame moving. Exactly where a trained burn boss intended it to move. Nothing left to chance. Nothing left for the wind to decide on its own. Priscilla Okonkwo, elected to the newly reconstituted board the following term, drove down that same afternoon to watch it with me from my own side of the fence, and told me the new board had adopted, at its very first meeting, a standing policy requiring any prescribed burn, fuel reduction project, or open flame activity to be conducted exclusively by state-certified contractors, with automatic postponement written into policy for any red flag warning issued within 24 hours of a scheduled burn, no board vote required, no discretion left for anyone to weigh cost against risk the way Diane once had. I still keep Kyle Purnell's original email, the one warning Diane Sorrell that his company held no certification and recommending she hire someone properly qualified instead, printed and framed now. In the equipment shed I rebuilt the same season as the barn, hanging above the workbench where I do most of my own repairs. Marcus asked me once why I bothered keeping it, given everything the case had already resolved. Because for 7 hours that morning, I told him somebody had a warning sitting in an inbox and a decision already made months earlier to save $40,000, and chose the second thing over the first, and I think that's worth remembering every single time I walk past it, for exactly as long as I keep rebuilding what that choice cost. He didn't argue with that. In 26 years working fire scenes together, I don't think I ever once heard him argue with a conclusion the evidence had already settled. The ranch house stands again now, board by original board, the same porch where I stood the night the smoke first reached me, the same view west across pasture my family has worked since 1889. Odalise planted new roses along the south fence the same week the house was finally finished. The same variety she confirmed from an old nursery catalog Odalise Farrow tracked down through more patience than I probably deserved, that my late wife had planted there decades earlier. It burned to nothing in a single night because somebody decided a wind warning and an uncertified crew were an acceptable risk against the cost of doing it properly. It stands again because somebody else, on the other side of that fence line, finally learned exactly what that risk had actually been worth, in the only language that decision ever seemed capable of understanding.